Hello everyone. For this lecture video, we will be talking about Module 3. It's all about exposure and vulnerability. For the previous lesson we were able to talk about disaster risk reduction, characteristics of disaster, and as well the impacts of disaster to those people that will be affected. For us to remember the topic we had last time, I prepared two questions for you to answer. The first one is, when does a natural event become a hazard? Natural event will become a hazard if it imposes threat to the people in that place. So there will be victim. Let's say, for example, the natural phenomena will strike that place. And question number two, when does a hazard become a disaster? That hazard will turn out to be a disaster if there are already victims. And so that ends for your module 2. Moving on with our module 3, I will be showing you three photos and you will be sharing your thoughts about the content of it. For the first picture, the question is, who is vulnerable and exposed in this picture? I believe your answer is the sick woman here. Yes, because if a typhoon or earthquake or volcanic eruption will happen, she cannot really perform, or she cannot run as fast as possible, or she cannot flee the place. That's why she is vulnerable. For picture number 2, who is vulnerable here? I believe your answer is the woman and her baby, especially the baby, because she is just relying protection coming from her parents. And for photo number 3, we have here the pregnant woman is the one that is exposed and vulnerable. Right, so there you go. We move on to our module 3. Here is the course outline. We will be talking about the various elements that may be exposed to hazards, about vulnerability of each exposed elements, and the concepts, principles, and relevance of disaster risk reduction. To begin with, we will talk about vulnerability first. When we say vulnerability, this is the diminished capacity of an individual or group to anticipate, cope up, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural or man-made hazard. Also, this is often associated with poverty because usually those who are poor, they are the ones that are isolated, sometimes they're insecure, they're defenseless to face the risk, shock, or stress coming from their environment. Well, when we say vulnerability, this may vary in terms of not just poverty, but also it has something to do with the lack of preparedness. So let's talk about the two. It says here, vulnerability may also vary in terms of, the first one is poverty. When it is associated with poverty, one example is people that are poor cannot usually construct their houses to withstand earthquake or a hurricane. They don't have the capacity to buy cement or rock that can make their houses sturdy, unlike the rich people. When it is associated also with preparedness, some people are educated and so they know how to respond when it comes to natural phenomena, but some are uneducated and they're not aware of the things that they will be doing when phenomena strike their place. All right. We have also here determining people's vulnerability. How can we determine it? First is to what threat or hazard are they vulnerable? We must know what usually strike their place. Is their place being struck by an earthquake? What is the hazard that usually affect them? Is it through war? Is it through flood? Or whatever hazard that may affect them. And the second one is what makes them vulnerable to that threat or hazard. So what's the reason? Why are they vulnerable? Is it because they're uneducated? Is it because they are poor? Or is it because they are unprepared? So whatever reason, it belongs to number 2. Okay, so here are some of the examples of potentially vulnerable groups. Pictures are not mine. All right, so we have here number 1, they are displaced populations who leave their residences collectively. It is usually the ones that are displaced when the certain phenomena strike their place. Of course, they're affected. They will leave their place. And the picture that you can see here on the left part is taken in Visayas. from the impact of Bagyong Agaton. Right, so they are moving out of their place because of flood. And so why are they vulnerable? Because when they go to other places, they do not have their own belongings there. They are vulnerable to sickness, they are vulnerable to isolation, to stress. They don't have food to eat. That's the reason that they are vulnerable. So here in the next picture, we have here migrants who leave or flee their residences, go to new places. How come that they are vulnerable? Because when they leave their places, of course, their house, their belongings, their business, their job, and they go to other place, they are new to every, especially their culture. And why are they vulnerable? Because they are prone to be victims of scammers, of the people na mapagsamantala in those places, especially if they don't know someone who can help them. So when we go to number three, we have here returnees. They are former migrants or displaced people returning to their homes. So in this photo, this one is a photo taken in Taal, to the residences, houses along or near Taal volcano. After Taal volcano erupted, of course, they are trying to recover and they are returning to their houses. And why are they vulnerable? As you can see here in the photo, they are vulnerable to chemicals, and it might affect their health. And also for number four, specific groups within the local population, such as marginalized, excluded, or destitute people. So here, for the marginalized or destitute or excluded, these are the people that they are living from far-flung places, and help coming from the government are not being received by the population. There are no doctors, na masyadong malayo yung place nila, no doctors, no teachers, they are isolated and they are prone, they are vulnerable. Right. Yes, we have number five, young children, pregnant and nursing women, unaccompanied children, widows, elderly people without family support, and disabled persons are also vulnerable. Moving on, we also have here some ways on how we can counteract vulnerability. First is we need to reduce the impact of the hazard itself through mitigation, prediction, and warning, also with preparedness. So, meaning to say, we must be prepared on whatever phenomena that will strike our place. The second one is building capacities to withstand and cope up with hazard. When we say capacity, it's not just belong to the physical aspect that we can see, like building our house with made of stones and cement. Building capacity has something to do also with our preparedness, our mind, our educational status. Are we informed? Are we aware? So it's good that we can also attend some seminars and be educated. Also, we have here tackling the root causes of vulnerability, such as poverty, poor governance, discrimination, inequality, inadequate access to resources, and livelihoods. This time, for tackling the root causes, we can have this one by joining some organizations, just like in your barangay. I believe that there are programs that inform people also about the root causes of vulnerability, and then they are teaching people what they will do if earthquake will happen, what will be the plan, where are they going to go, where's the evacuation center. So with these three, this can counteract vulnerability of people living in a certain barangay or in a certain place. Now, here, we're done with vulnerability. We will move on to exposure. Still, it is associated to vulnerability. When we say exposure, this means the total population living in an unaffected area for each event. So, whoever lives in that population that is being affected by a hazard, they are the exposed elements. So exposure, the total population, exposed elements is the term to be used when you are referring to them. So this can refer to the number of people or structures within the exposed area. Okay. Moving on, we also have here exposed elements usually fall under social, environmental, and economic aspects. When disaster strikes, Casualties and property losses and damages are the first to be reported in tri-media. This is correct because whenever there are accidents, the one that is being reported is how many people were dead, how many houses were destroyed, and so on and so forth. But long after a disaster are long consequences that cannot be measured or quantified as easily as property losses or damages, such as mental health, mental aspect of the people, their emotion, what happened to them, because it will just arise as time passes on, caused by stress they experienced during the disaster. Tangible or intangible losses fall under social, environmental, and economic categories. That's why we will be tackling about the three aspects: social, environmental, and economic. Let's talk about social first. When I say social, it has something to do with the way people live. The social dimension of exposure and vulnerability covers a wide range of concerns, including migration, social groups, health and well being, education, culture, institutions, and governance aspects. So, if you will see this, it has something to do on how people live. It has something to do with the demography. So, we can see the demography of a certain population by locating or by looking at the population density map of that place. Right, moving on to number two, we have environmental elements that are exposed. So these are the physical aspects of exposure and vulnerability that refer to the location and built structures in that place. They are exposed and they belong under environmental exposed elements. Some of the examples are the following: essential facilities. So, when a disaster will strike that place, this could be exposed, like educational facilities, our school, medical and healthcare facilities, our hospitals, emergency response facilities, like our fire stations, government offices, recreational or tourist facilities, our parks, places of worship are churches, banks and financial centers, markets and shopping areas, and also cemeteries. Also, this can be exposed to industrial and high potential loss facilities and facilities containing hazardous materials, just like dams and ponds. We also have here fuel reservoir like gasoline stations, power generating plants as well, multi-purpose hydropower plants, and food processing facilities like factories. For number three, also, this possible that this may be exposed, like the transportation lifelines, like highways, bridges, railway tracks, tunnels, bus facilities, port and harbor facilities, airport facilities, and runways. Also, for number four, lastly, we have utility lifelines. They are also exposed to natural phenomena like potable water facilities. Here in our locality, we have Bawadi. Oil and natural gas system facilities. We also have electric power facilities, our Bineco, communication facilities and distribution lines like Globe and Smart. We also have Sky Cable and whatever communication facilities that we have. All right. So when we go to number three under economic, it has something to do with how we live, our status of living, our trading system. So it's possible that the following can be exposed to: the business interruptions due to accessibility problems. Businesses will be interrupted if this economic aspect will be exposed. Also, loss of jobs and access to work, since there are no job, people cannot go to work, it will also affect the company. And the loss of government income due to inability of businesses and people to pay taxes at the time when more funds are needed for relief and rehabilitation. So with this, it can also significantly affect the gross domestic product of our country, and our economy will generally go down and people will suffer. All right, so these are the three aspects that can be exposed if a natural phenomena or a man-made failure or disaster may strike a certain place. Let's continue. We have here quantifying vulnerability. Quantifying the tangible aspects of vulnerability and loss is useful in estimating more precisely how much mitigation and preparedness measures shall be applied. When we say quantifying, you're putting it into numbers. How many are of the casualties? You are now listing the numbers of the people who are dead, how many buildings were burnt. And so to do that for people, let's say for example, vulnerability can be measured as a ratio of casualties or injured to the total population. So let's say, for example, in that certain barangay, there are 100 people who are living. So you can say 10 people out of the 100 residents were injured. Like that. And also, when we're talking about buildings, it can be also expressed as a repair cost or as a degree of physical damage. Let's say, for example, we're talking about a house that was burnt by fire. Then the reporter will just say, almost all of the houses were burned, or like 70% of the house were damaged, so they can say it in that way. And when dealing with larger area, it may be measured in terms of the proportion of damaged buildings. So they can just say out of 10 houses, 5 were destroyed. So you can just put it into ratio and proportion also. That's why if you are listening to some news, you can notice that they are really quantifying it. They're putting it into percentages, or they're really giving tangible numbers. So we will be aware how many were usually affected by the certain disaster. All right. Moving on, we also have here exposed elements usually fall under social, environmental, and economic aspects. When disaster strikes, casualties and property losses and damages are the first to be reported in tri-media. This is correct because whenever there are accidents, the one that is being reported is how many people were dead, how many houses were destroyed, and so on and so forth. But long after a disaster are long consequences that cannot be measured or quantified as easily as property losses or damages, such as mental aspect of the people, their emotion, what happened to them, because it will just arise as time passes on, caused by stress they experienced during the disaster. Tangible or intangible losses fall under social, environmental, and economic categories. That's why we will be tackling about the three. And also, we have also here to define disaster risk reduction. This is usually associated with long-term planning across sectors. It must be integrated into general, national, and regional development strategies. That's the reason that we have the DRRR subject, as mentioned a while ago. DRRR strategies usually begin with plans for assessing the hazard, the risk, the extent of harm that could happen in that community, and also the vulnerable people. These are very important. We need to know what particular hazard is involved, the risk, the extent of harm, and also who are the vulnerable people. Now, here are the key components of DRRR and management. You can see here, disaster risk management is divided into two: disaster risk reduction, and the second one is disaster management. Under disaster risk reduction, we have here prevention, mitigation, adaptation, preparedness, relief, and recovery naman under disaster management. So in a certain phenomena, let's say for example in your place, you are prone to earthquake. And I believe you have programs that can help you prepare with the impact of the earthquake. So you have pre-event task to do and then a post-event task. Here on the next slide, we have here disaster risk reduction. Before a certain phenomena will strike our place, here are the pre-event things that we need to be mindful of. We have here number one, prevention. You need to be aware, and you need to prevent whatever the impact of the hazard to us. Mitigation also. For mitigation, it's just quite similar to prevention, but in mitigation, you are lessening or you are limiting whatever the adverse impact of hazard in your place. For adaptation, you are adapting or adjusting to the natural or man-made system that is happening in your place. That's why you're making a way in order to protect yourself. And when we say preparedness, that is now you are enhancing your knowledge, you're developing your skills on how you can counteract with the negative impact of the hazard or disaster that comes your population or comes your community. So these are the four pre-event things that we need to do in order for us to survive when a certain phenomena strikes our place. After a disaster, let's say for example, nagkaroon na ng earthquake. After that, response and recovery will be implemented also. For response, these are the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives. So after earthquake, your barangay officials or whoever, the police officers, they are now inspecting the places. So sino yung mga casualties. And for the recovery, these are the program that can help the population in order for them to recover from the impact of the disaster. So these are the pre-event and then the post-event things that we need to do if a disaster will happen. Okay, so we have here an example of a certain community based disaster risk reduction management done in Thailand. So it actually in Thailand they also inculcated it in their curriculum. So here the title of their program is School Children as Disaster Risk Reduction Catalysts and Initiators. It means to say school children, when there is a tsunami in their place, they will usually help in aiding, they usually help during the recovery, or they will help during the disaster. So here, only after the December 24 Asian tsunami disaster, that disaster risk reduction has been a focus of interest in Thailand. So in 2006, a project called Child-Led Disaster Risk Reduction in Thailand project was initiated. So this is done by building children's knowledge of disaster risk reduction and community risk, building the capacity of children for DRRR actions, and also sensitizing adults on the importance of involving children in DRRR. So it means to say they are really using these children, not using, but they're allowing these children to help and aid during disaster, like tsunami on their place. And go to the impact and result, you can see here that children and teachers have received information and instruction on how to cope better with disaster. So they're being trained. And what do you think is the impact, or what do you think would be the long term result of this? Of course, since they are knowledgeable, they are trained, they know what to do if tsunami will happen, and it will lessen the vulnerability of the children and also the people in their community. So this is one important way on how we can reduce vulnerability in our locality. Yeah, so to summarize our topic for today, we were able to talk about vulnerability, about exposure, about quantifying vulnerability, also disaster risk reduction, and there are examples provided. Not only one example, by the way, you can also check your module and you still have two more examples to read. Here on the next slide, we have here disaster risk reduction. Before a certain phenomena will strike our place, here are the pre-event things that we need to be mindful of. We have here number one, prevention. You need to be aware and you need to prevent whatever the impact of after a disaster. Let's say for example, nagkaroon na ng earthquake. After that, response and recovery will be implemented also. For response, these are the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives. So after earthquake, your barangay officials or whoever, the police officers, they are now inspecting the places. So sino yung mga casualties. And for the recovery, these are the program that can help the population in order for them to recover from the impact of the disaster. So these are the pre-event and then the post-event things that we need to do if a disaster will happen. We also have potential issues and the suggested action. You can just identify three as mentioned. So tatlong problema why is it that it's hazardous, and then you can suggest what could be the action that you will be taken. All right, in order for you to resolve the problem. Ayan lang. That ends my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.